Okay. By the way, that's Kierkegaard there. I don't know if you can see what's in the background. There's a Mortal Kombat arcade machine. A picture of Immanuel Kant's got a little glare, though. That one's from Pulp Fiction, and that's Bruce Lee with a basketball. And there's, I think, a bar. Yeah, you could see, yeah, bar cart back there. Okay. We left off in the last video saying what the course was about, and we said it's about a critique of the metaphysics of modernity, of the ontology of modernity, or the lack of ontology of modernity, which are two things, which are really the same thing. Postmodernism and scientific reductionism. Postmodernism, a critique of reason, a critique of truth. Scientific reductionism, truth is only what empirical science can tell us, right? But where does the metaphysics of modernity come from? It doesn't just fall out of the sky. It doesn't just appear. What's the origin of it? By the way, another way of saying what the metaphysics of modernity is, or modernity in the West, is a critique of the West, right? The metaphysics of modernity, or the metaphysics of Western culture, is a critique, is precisely an eating of itself, a critique of Western culture. Western culture is collapsing. Think about this. All the institutions are collapsing. The presidency almost collapsed. Academia is collapsing. The church is dying, right? If you go to Europe, most churches are grocery stores and things, okay? This leads to, this is a term, this collapse of Western culture is called by Nietzsche, and it's called by other philosophers as well, the death of God. Atheism, nihilism, relativism, atheism, the idea that nothing means anything, nihilism. Okay, where did that come from? Where did the idea that where did Western culture come from? What is Western culture? Where did it come from, and why is it eating itself? These are really interesting questions. Why is it so on fire right now? Okay, it just seems to be getting worse and worse. It's a really terrible time, an interesting, terribly interesting time. I don't know how to put it, but we're in a time where Western culture is falling apart. Why is it falling apart? What's interesting is Nietzsche predicted this, and so say what you want about it. He was right about a lot. Now, I don't necessarily, maybe you won't necessarily agree with him all the way, but he's got a lot of insights here. So, scientific reductionism and postmodernism. This is the death of God. This is Western culture destroying itself. What is Western culture? Where did it come from? Well, for Nietzsche, that's what we're going to be exploring. But just very simply and very quickly, Western culture was and sort of still is Judeo-Christian, okay? Jewish and Christian, Judeo-Christian. But it's not just Jewish and Christian. It's also Platonic. It's also metaphysical. It also has its origins in Greek metaphysics, right? And by Platonism, Nietzsche says very famously, Christianity is just Platonism watered down, or Platonism for the hoi polloi, or Platonism for the masses, right? And what he means by that is Platonism is this idea of the split world. The world is split in two. The world is split in two from the ideal world and the apparent world, or the apparent world and the real world, the world of the forms, heaven and earth, the sensible world and the super sensible world, the idea of the forms, the idea of absolute truth, right? That's Christianity in a certain sense. So the origin of Western culture is Judeo-Christian and Platonic. And what are the values that come out of this Judeo-Christian and Platonic culture? They're very simply two things: universal truth, absolute truth, the idea of a celebration of reason, that reason can know the world, if you will, that the world is intelligible, that it's ordered, and social justice. Now, Nietzsche doesn't call it social justice, he'll call it equality, but by that he means social justice, or we could simply say the mercy ethic, or the victim ethic, the idea that we should have a concern for victims, the oppressed, the marginalized, okay? Truth, social justice. These are the values of Western culture, okay? That come from Judeo-Christian Platonism, really, okay? Now, Nietzsche thinks that with the rise of science and technology, which, by the way, science for Nietzsche is a Christian theistic project, right? So Platonism, Judeo-Christianity leads to science, which then starts eating itself, starts killing off its own values, namely the Christian metaphysics, right? The idea of a transcendent world, right? And this is the beginning of it. So the death of God is really wrought by science, modern science, which itself is a Christian project. We'll have to go over this, but I'm just sort of throwing this out at you. And nevertheless, some of the values still stay, like social justice. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who would deny that we should be kind to victims. Or if they did deny it, they would be in trouble, let's say. They might be canceled, if you will. I hope I'm using that right. But seriously, you'd be in trouble if you started to say that victims don't matter, if you were actually to say something like that. I mean, the closest thing we get to that is Nazism, right? Where people say, let the weak die off. This kind of radical Darwinism, which, by the way, Nietzsche agrees with, okay? But these are the two values of Western culture. And what's interesting is Western culture's values Western culture's own values are destroying itself. Science destroyed this idea of religion, right? The idea of God in the transcendent realm. But Judeo-Christianity's social justice ethic starts to critique itself, right? That Western culture is actually really evil, that it's racist, that it's sexist, that it's homophobic, transphobic, that it marginalizes ipso facto. The West is this horrible culture, right? But it's the very value in Western culture of social justice that comes out of Judeo-Christianity, which Nietzsche has a long explanation for why that is the case, that actually contributes to the destruction of it. So those two values, the idea of absolute truth and social justice, actually begin to destroy Western culture's foundations, which result in scientific reductionism and postmodernism.